Re-Zero, Arc 9, Chapter 27, Words of a Child.
With a cross-shaped swing, the twin swords carved a decisive wound into their opponent. Bleeding from countless shallow wounds that covered his entire body, Wilhelm was unable to hide his frustration at his own poor sword skills. Wilhelm, weak. What poured out from behind his clenched teeth was disappointment and frustration toward his aging and worn-out self. As time passed and he grew old, he felt so ashamed of his own inadequacy that he wanted to hide his face. If he had been a poet or an artist, the accumulated years would have become knowledge and skill, and his words and brushstrokes would have become more refined, reaching heights he could never have achieved in his youth. However, that was not the case for a swordsman. The passage of time had made him feel his age, and had only intensified his passion, leaving him with no excuses. His strength, skill, and speed were nothing compared to when he was at his peak, and that was simply frustrating. He had experienced the same frustration many times before, even when he decided to withdraw from the front lines and retire from active duty as the captain of the Royal Guard, even when his wife was lost to the White Whale and he spent 14 years seeking revenge. Only then did he realize that he had no choice but to face his sworn enemy with weakened sword skills. The unbearable frustration that now consumed Wilhelm was unparalleled by anything he had yet experienced in his life, equal only to the moment he first learned that Teresia was the sword saint during the Demi-Human War, when he realized he was no match for her. Weak. Far too weak. In a world where strength was valued above all else, that weakness was an unforgivable sin. In this world, petty excuses did not work. Being strong or weak, those were the only factors. Talent, slothfulness, illness, old age, none held meaning once one stepped onto the stage where strength is pitted against strength. After all, a sword cannot choose its wielder. Then, it was only natural that those who wield swords had no excuse. No, in this world, there was a sword that chose its wielders. Hence why, the one chosen by that sword stood atop a world without excuses. That was precisely why Wilhelm Triers, who could not use his advancing age and declining condition as an excuse, had to defeat this opponent with his own hands at any cost. Wilhelm, regardless of Wilhelm's self-assessment, the battle where he demonstrated his most formidable swordsmanship in decades came to an end, and the formidable shinobi was defeated. Among all the shinobi Wilhelm had faced, she was undoubtedly the most skilled. It was impossible to imagine how much training the girl had undergone to reach such heights, but there were no consolation prizes in the world of combat. That was the cruelest aspect of the way of the sword. Even if one loved the sword above all else, whether or not the sword reciprocated that love had nothing to do with the depth or magnitude of their love. Instead, the deeper and greater that love was, the more the heart would crack and break irreparably when that love was not reciprocated. With that sentiment in the back of his mind, Wilhelm remained vigilant even though the outcome had already been decided. In the distance, the body of the fallen girl caught his attention, hanging in midair upon a single thread. Blood dripped down her upturned body, but her thin torso was not severed. That was the reason for his caution. In such a life-or-death battle, there was no room for mercy. Wilhelm gave no consideration whatsoever to his opponent's age, gender, or circumstances. He had swung his sword with the intention of taking her life, of this there was no doubt. And yet, the fact that the girl's body was not sliced in two demonstrated not only Wilhelm's lack of skill with the sword, but also that the girl had somehow avoided a fatal blow, the most likely reason being, Wilhelm, threads, is it? Using all of her fingers and toes, the girl had weaved threads that extended into the hole that led to the bottom of the underground chamber. In order to wield them freely, one would need rare talent and painstaking training. This technique could be used as a blade to cut through opponents, or as chains to restrain enemy movements. When wrapped tightly around the body, it could even serve as armor to protect against sword strikes. As the final blow was about to be delivered, the girl made a move to protect her neck and heart, and Wilhelm slashed at her exposed torso with all his might. Such was her momentary evasive maneuver. With her split-second judgment, the girl had managed to keep a glimmer of hope alive. He had nothing but respect for her. Although he remained vigilant, Wilhelm also wanted the girl to survive. This was because it was the common opinion among his allies that it would be preferable to capture her alive if possible. A faint moan escaped from the suspended girl's thin throat. Wilhelm was about to approach the girl by positioning himself, thrusting his sword into the wall. Sensing his presence, the girl's trembling eyelids opened, and her red eyes reflected Wilhelm. Wilhelm remained on guard in response. However, he was certain from the feeling of his sword that it was impossible to counterattack from that position. He had wielded the sword for 50 years now, and during that time, he had danced with death in countless life-risking battles and reaped the lives of numerous opponents. All the past experiences of bloodshed and taken lives were telling Wilhelm the exact depth of the wounds he had inflicted on his opponent. Wilhelm, therefore, no matter how much the girl tried to hint with her deceitful gaze at still having some kind of trump card up her sleeve, Wilhelm saw through it as the desperate bluff it was and did not stop his ceaseless approach. "Wilhelm, I do not know the details of the situation either, but it would be best for you to stop resisting and us not to fight any longer. Soon, Aldono shall be held in custody too." Seeing through her bluff, Wilhelm attempted to stop the girl from pointlessly resisting any further. That girl was one of the individuals who had conspired with Priscilla Bariel's night, also Wilhelm had heard. He could only speculate that the tragic and unfortunate loss of Priscilla's life in the Volcainian Empire may have been the catalyst that had driven Al to commit these crimes. Wilhelm understood all too well what Al, someone who had just lost a loved one, was currently feeling. He must have felt like his body had been mutilated, his heart torn apart, and his soul feeling as if he was burning endlessly with an unfathomable sense of powerlessness. However, the world could not be allowed to be destroyed purely because of those negative emotions. Moreover, it was impossible to overlook the fact that one of Wilhelm's benefactors was among the victims of this rampage. Al's plots must be averted. This was tantamount to suppressing all who were complicit in the scheme and cooperating with Al for whatever reason. The same applied to the other co-conspirators, no matter who or what they were. This shinobi girl was merely one of the cogs that needed to be removed from the machine. Yea, this is the worst. These words were uttered in the weak, faint breaths of someone barely clinging on to life. The girl suspended in the air seemed to realize that her bluff had not worked on Wilhelm, and could not hide her immense disappointment in herself. That was, "Yea, I can't believe I'm dragging you down like this." If she had not been suspended in midair, her deep remorse might even have been accompanied by actual tears. If that remorse had only been based on the outcome of the battle with Wilhelm, Wilhelm might have finally let down his last shred of caution. However, he did not. Immediately after the girl's muttering, a sound was heard. Overhead, from outside the hole, there was a heavy thud, like something falling to the floor. Following that, hearing a sudden cry of pain, and realizing it was Feltz, whom he had left in the room above, Wilhelm kicked off the wall and jumped up, using the sword that he had stuck into its structure for support. Wilhelm performed a triple jump and leapt out of the hole, his eyes wide open in a frantic hurry. Felt, floating in the air was Felt, frantically kicking her legs, desperately clawing at her neck with her fingers. She was hanging in midair from a thread around her neck. However, the girl who orchestrated this most likely did not have the energy left to do so. Then, Wilhelm saw that part of the wall had collapsed in the corner of the room, and realized that it had been the source of the sound he had heard earlier and the mechanism that was now keeping Felt suspended. A thread had been attached to Felt's neck, and when the wall, which had been cut at an angle in advance, collapsed at the appointed time, the thread was pulled, leaving her hanging in midair. This way, no matter how the battle progressed, regardless of whether the girl lived or died, the trap would have been activated and Felt would be dangling in the air. "Wilhelm, I will help you now," Wilhelm was about to say, running over to Felt with sword in hand. The thread was strong, but without its user, its strength could not surpass a sword strike. Rescuing Felt was simple. And the girl who set the trap could not possibly escape. Originally, her purpose in setting up the timed trap must have been to distract Wilhelm from herself in the event of a prolonged battle, and to catch him by surprise or to allow for a quick escape. However, the battle had been decided before the trap ever had the chance to be set off, and the girl was too severely injured to make an escape. The trap gave her no opportunity for a surprise attack, or time to escape. Either way, Felt, who had gotten the brunt of the surprise attack, was still being hanged. Or so Wilhelm thought. At this point, Wilhelm's train of thought was natural, and no one could blame him. After all, at that point, the only people who truly understood the significance of Felt's hanging were those who were the source of the threat to the kingdom. It was just, yay, I can't believe I'm dragging you down like this. If there had been time to fathom the true meaning behind the remorseful words of the girl hanging in midair, things might have been different. The girl's regret was not in her defeat itself, but what came after. What she regretted was not her defeat, but the insurance that followed. Felt, away. Just before Wilhelm's sword strike cut the thread, Felt, who was being hanged, was desperately trying to make some sort of appeal with a hoarse breath. It was not a plea for help. It was a plea for him to run away. Wilhelm. Immediately after, Wilhelm's eyes caught sight of it. The giant arm of a dragon effortlessly smashed through the wall of the Bariel Manor, and mercilessly struck Wilhelm from the side, to infiltrate the royal capital of Lugunica and release the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony, held captive in the prison tower. When Aldebaran revealed that utterly preposterous, batshit insane course of action, before promptly entering the city on his own, Hankl harbored some complex reservations. The root of Aldebaran's objective, this had not been shared with Hankl. He seemed to possess a similar amount of information as the obedient Ye, but unlike Hankl, who sought recompense for assisting Aldebaran, the reason behind Ye's participation in these plans seemed to stem from a distorted obsession regarding Aldebaran. Hankl, a distorted obsession, huh? How could anyone declare that so shamelessly? Neither love nor hatred, the emotions Ye bore Aldebaran were enigmatic. When he measured himself against that, Hankl derided himself in a terribly bleak manner. To begin with, through what means could one even measure whether something was straight or distorted? If Ye's obsession was to be evaluated as distorted, then what about his? What about Hankl's obsession, which had reduced him to a traitor in pursuit of the means to awaken his ever-slumbering wife? Hankl, HK, a soliloquy tinged with self-condemnation and derision, as it triggered the outbreak of a fissering headache. Hankl pressed a finger into his temple, attempting to mask the pain. Normally, the best remedy for this pain, akin to a fog that gave no answers, was alcohol. Though it would not alleviate the pain, alcohol would numb him, allowing him to temporarily forget about it. Though he knew it to be unhealthy, Hankl could not so much as open his eyes to see things properly unless he was swimming amidst the intoxication of alcohol. And yet, right now, he could not afford to drink, to seek that intoxication to mask the pain. At long last, the time might finally be upon him. After nearly 20 years of pursuit, the time for the dearest wish he had longed for, coveting to the point of fissuring his very soul, was upon him. Hankl, Lawana. On the backs of his closed eyelids, as his lips spun the name of a lovely woman, her visage emerged, just the same as the day he met her. The form of his youthful, sweet, lovely wife had not changed in the slightest since the year she began to slumber. That was not because of a lack of forming any new memories. Her sleeping visage had truly disregarded all passage of time, continuing to be as it always had been. He wished to see her open her eyes again. Spinning words with her lips, with nary an inhibition in contrast to her pretty appearance, unable to sit still for even a second, he wished to burn her lively way of being into his consciousness. As long as that came true, Hankl's life could end without desiring anything further. Hankl, old man, you being negative again? You're giving off that sort of vibe, you know? At the sudden voice from right under him, Hankl's breath caught. As Hankl continued to bore into his temple, the divine dragon called out to him like so as it spread its wings. Contrary to its grand and mighty presence, the divine dragon spoke in an exceedingly frivolous manner, and despite not even being able to see Hankl riding upon its back, it still perceptively picked up on his subtleties. At a question that could not be classified as concern from the divine dragon, Hankl was at a loss for an answer. That was a matter of course. After all, for Hankl, being left alone with just the divine dragon like this was something akin to a flying dragon or water dragon having their favorite food dangled before their snout. In order to wake up the slumbering Lawana Astria, Hankl had searched through all sorts of methods, magic and curse arts, meteors and magic creation tools, he had tried everything. With each and every one of those hopes severed, Hankl's final ray of hope was the dragon's blood. With that great treasure, said to cure every disease and bring about bountiful harvests to even the most barren of lands, he would awaken Lawana. And right now, the heart fueled by that very treasure was asserting its presence, beating in a place so close that Hankl could draw his sword and reach it. But then again, Hankl, leave it be. Don't concern yourself with me, divine dragon, I said to stop having such sulky reactions. Old man, I get that you want to hurry, and how frustrating it must be for you to be alone with me. That's why I intended to properly put on the brakes for you, old man, as my own sort of consideration. Hankl, consideration, you say? Don't tell me that's what you think this was supposed to be, divine dragon. I did intend on telling you that's what I thought this was, but I guess saying it'd be no good. Without a hint of ill will, what the divine dragon's seemingly puzzled words were referring to, it was none other than the current location of itself and Hankl, that being far from the land, high above the clouds, riding on the divine dragon's back, Hankl was present in high altitudes of the ether. Perhaps because the divine dragon was controlling the wind, he was exposed to no shaking or strong gales, and excluding the stiffness of the scales, it was a comfortable environment. But the consideration that the divine dragon was speaking of, it likely had nothing to do with this comfort. Rather, for the unlikely chance that Hankl drew blade, it was regarding the maintenance of this high altitude permitting no salvation. Divine dragon, even if you were able to gouge out my heart and obtain my heart's blood, it'd be meaningless since we'd both plummet to our deaths. Hence, even if we're left alone, you can't lay a hand on me here, old man. How about it? Not too shabby an idea, yeah? Hankl, I don't want to hear that from you. First of all, that sort of thing shouldn't even be called concern or a calculating move. What if your planning was off? There's a possibility that I just draw my sword without thinking of the consequences. Divine dragon, nah, you'd never do that. Old man, you're too decent for that. Hankl, wah, divine dragon, decent guys, they always consider fear. I've come to know many various people with a screw loose until now, and you'd never be like 'em, old man. Saying all it had to say, everything it pleased, the divine dragon's oracle caused Hankl's mouth to gape open and closed, unable to form an immediate refutation. Only, the reason for his ears flushing a bright red, was it anger or embarrassment? In the case of the former, then the fact that he did not begin shouting curses without thinking about the consequences was in accordance with the divine dragon's expectations. In the case of the latter, then the fact that he had an idea of what he was being chided about was in accordance with the divine dragon's expectations. In other words, the moment his ears flushed red, Hankl's defeat was set in stone. Hankl, me, decent, you say? Pressing his finger into his head with greater strength, Hankl's voice rasped at the divine dragon's evaluation. Decent, considering Hankl's current position, it was far too ironic of an appraisal. What the hell was the divine dragon thinking? Would a decent person fall to the extremities of self-centeredness, turning traitor against their country? Hankl was neither decent, nor honest. He was not worthy of an appraisal that expressed such virtue, ubiquitously earned by many townspeople. Hankl, that's why, when Miss Priscilla passed away, I went along with Aldebaran's proposal, intervening in the national crisis befalling the Volcainian Empire. Priscilla Bariel had lost her life. Hankl was in a position such that, no matter what, he would never say that he had pledged loyalty to her. His relationship with her had been a cooperative one, born of shared interest. Even that, with how things were now, Hankl would never know just how much value Priscilla saw in him. Only, though Hankl had not pledged his loyalty to Priscilla, neither did he doubt her capacity as a ruler to win the throne, guiding the people of the kingdom as their new monarch. With outstanding capabilities, the wisdom to see ahead, and a beautiful appearance, all fine attributes befitting a queen, Priscilla possessed the qualifications to become the queen of the kingdom of Volcanica. Upon the dawn of her ascendance to the throne, he was supposed to have received a license to the dragon's blood as his reward. That hope had wilted in the empire, alongside Priscilla's life. From the bottom of his heart, he found it unfortunate. The fact that he had been unable to secure the dragon's blood, and the fact that Priscilla's rule over the kingdom of Volcanica never came to fruition. Thus, having lost all hope, the stricken Hankl was proffered a hand by Aldebaran. In exchange for assisting him, and becoming an enemy of the world, he could obtain the dragon's blood. To Hankl's ears, that proposal rang far too sweetly. The hope that he was supposed to have obtained, seeing it ripped away right before his eyes, was harsh. Moreover, this was the second time for Hankl, the second time that the light of hope was extinguished right when he was but a step away. The first time, he had missed his chance due to a foolish mistake, and the accompanying feeling of helplessness was difficult to forget. Hence, this time, Hankl would absolutely cling to any wretched possibility. For him to be decent was extremely off base from the divine dragon. Divine dragon, has your husk been filled with displeasure again? This may be coming from me, but there's nobody who'd love a difficult middle-aged man, yeah? Hankl, it's too late for that sort of thing. Divine dragon, you sure complicate things, don't you now? Well, it's seriously like a boomerang, so I won't say anything more. Even with just the simple gesture of shrugging its shoulders, the divine dragon's body was far too exaggerated. In that eerily human gesture, Hankl found a certain commonality with Aldebaran, and ignored the increasing pain of his headache at the inscrutability, to not be loved by anyone. That was exactly what Hankl desired, that he had not been loved even once. He was not such a fool to make any such warped, careless remarks. Hankl had been loved from birth, and there was no shortage of people who had loved him since, and, not only did he fail to repay the affection that had been directed towards him, he betrayed it, marching through the rain. Divine dragon. Come to think of it, we never really get this sorta one-on-one time, and I remembered that there were some things I wanted to check with you, old man. Hankl, can't you just be quiet and wait? Divine dragon, I'm the type who can't bear silence. Might because I was always with someone who would never stop talking. He was completely ignorant regarding how the divine dragon operated, but the other party had not spoken much about it, and Hankl was not eager to know. Either way, once this was all over, this was an individual who he would have died in order to procure its heart's blood. There was no need to go out of his way to add any reasons to feel guilty for doing so. Besides, though consideration might have been the reason, he was grateful for the flow of the conversation to shift from what it had been to that point. Were they to discuss another topic, then perhaps this headache might fade a bit. Hankl, so, most esteemed divine dragon Summer, what was it that you wanted to ask me? Divine dragon, it's nothing too important, but you're excessively sturdy, right, old man? So, I was wondering if you had any idea of why you're so sturdy. Hankl, divine dragon, Did I do something? At the divine dragon's innocent words, Hankl ground his teeth in annoyance, the pain in his head intensifying. This served as proof that Hankl's plans from a moment ago had failed. He had hoped for the focus of the conversation to change, but this was evidence that it had not. Hankl, hushed in silence, Hankl looked down at his open palm, and sighed. The divine dragon's query had been in regards to Hankl's body. Of course, that was his own body. He was aware of its abnormality, and was also properly aware of the reasons for it. Among the many sins Hankl had committed, this was punishment for an especially grave one. Laoana Astria's unwakeable slumber. Including Hankl, that was undoubtedly the beginning of the Astria family's division, but more decisive had been the events of 15 years prior. In the midst of Teresia van Astria's deployment, the subjugation of the White Whale, the transfer of the divine protection of the Sword Saint had resulted in the change of Sword Saint, and Teresia's death. Serving as the impetus to all that, was the abduction of Royal Prince Ford Lagunica's esteemed daughter. The night of the incident, Hankl had perpetrated an unforgivable betrayal, and the worst possible mistake that had made his betrayal meaningless. The divine punishment bequeathed was the current Hankl. Hankl, I've got no reason to deliberately reveal that to you, divine dragon. Oh, you're really saying that? In that case, if you don't tell me, I'll report to the other me that you were being uncooperative, old man, annulling that promise you guys had. What if I threaten you like that? Hankl, you, divine dragon, I'm kidding, just kidding. There's probably 50 or 100 things that you don't want to say. You and me both, old man. Hankl, 100 things, that's a lot. As the divine dragon made small talk that could not be perceived as anything small, Hankl feebly responded with just that. It had said 50 or 100 things, but the things Hankl harbored could be counted on a single hand. And that single hand was already heavy enough to crush his fragile self. Even so, connecting that which had been fractured, dragging along that which had been tensed, just a little bit more, if he just continued a little longer, then finally, Divine Dragon, Hankl, What is it? Perceiving a slight change in the atmosphere, Hankl questioned the Divine Dragon. For a moment, hesitating on whether to regularly call it Volcanica or not, he ultimately settled with an innocuous phrasing. But, paying no heed to Hankl's indecision, the Divine Dragon took a nosedive facing downwards, below the clouds, towards the royal capital, and then, Divine Dragon, hold on tight, old man, Hankl, Bora. The next moment, as a windstorm seemed to push down on him from above, it slammed Hankl down onto the Divine Dragon's back, as if he were prostrating himself. Without even the time to catch his breath from the sudden impact, the Divine Dragon descended in one fell swoop with Hankl affixed to its back, piercing into the royal capital's skies, their act of lurking above the clouds to conceal themselves while Aldebaran was raiding the prison tower, came to naught. That was to say, the need to reveal themselves had been born. In such a manner, the Divine Dragon arrived at their destination with such speed that Hankl had not even been able to lift his head. With a swing of its unruly dragon forearm, a hole was perforated through the wall of the building alongside an intense sound of destruction. The reason and the target of that exceedingly sudden violent outburst were entirely unknown to him. Only, the building on the receiving end of the Divine Dragon's calamitous strike was ruthlessly demolished, the dragon claws thoroughly crushing everything inside. Divine Dragon, you've got to be kidding me. That was a voice of absolute shock, spilling from the mouth of the Divine Dragon who had perpetrated that merciless act of destruction. Sharpening its golden eyes, the Divine Dragon surveyed the interior of the building it had thrown its arm into, and faced with the result of its relentless demolishment, it expressed its astonishment. That was only natural. The Divine Dragon's claws, tougher and sharper than most of the blades in this world, had been severed, torn off, and reduced to dust. And, as for the one who had done that, Hankl, esteemed father, taking a stance with their twin swords in the half-destroyed building, was the being who had just fended off the Divine Dragon's claws, the sword demon, Wilhelm van Astria. My thanks, parrying the dragon claws, barely managing to repel them as both his arms went numb, Wilhelm proclaimed his gratitude to Felt, who had informed him of the looming threat. A thread bound to her neck, Felt had been hung up in the air. Whilst in a situation in which her own life had been in danger, she had nevertheless commanded Wilhelm to ready himself, rather than seek his help. Thanks to her, he had managed to take a defensive stance by the skin of his teeth. Nah, normally, that ain't something you can stop even if you react in time. And, in regards to Wilhelm's deep emotions, the one to raise their voice was the enormous body standing outside the manor, a presence so fearsome and mystical that many would prostrate themselves upon merely laying eyes on them, an individual harboring absolute power. The imposing form of the Divine Dragon Volcanica had been peering into the mansion from outside. Felt, cough. I'm in agreement with that dragon. I told you to run away, yeah. Not to get EO. Of all the things for Felt to have said in her violent coughing fit, she expressed agreement with Volcanica's opinion. Taking advantage of the chaos of the dragon claws, she had been released from her midair suspension. No, Wilhelm's eyes had grasped the events that had come to pass in even more accurate fashion. It was no coincidence that Felt had been saved without a hand from Wilhelm. Wilhelm, it cannot be, you came to save Felt Summer. Volcanica, it's tough to say yes or no given our positions, but if I went and said yes here, would Felt Chan then be publicly considered as a member of our team of traitors? Felt, they aren't my allies. But, there's no doubt that it came flying in to save me. With a faint lingering sensation of having been hanged, Felt responded so as she rubbed her neck. No refutation came from Volcanica's end, either. It seemed that through some means, the dragon had sensed Felt's predicament, and had flown to this place in order to rescue her. In other words, the shinobi girl had aimed that far ahead in attaching a thread to Felt's neck. Be that as it may, Wilhelm, it appears to be a sore spot for the person in question. After all, The fact that you have come here would mean, Volcanica, I can't go to back up the me over there, Wilhelm, indeed. Incidentally, your manner of speech has altered quite a bit. Compared to 40 years ago, when I merely captured a glimpse of you, you were almost a completely different person. No, a different dragon, Volcanica. There's a saying that goes, if you don't see a man for 3 days. 40 years is a hell of a long time. A summer can work real magic on girls, Grandpa. Wilhelm, I see. Though those words had been given in response, it was not an answer that provided him with an understanding of Volcanica's change. Only, Wilhelm had not the time to investigate that change in demeanor here. There were things to prioritize over that. In its intrusion, Volcanica had not been by their lonesome. It seemed that the dragon was carrying another upon its back. For their mouth to have remained without use up till this point, concealing their presence, had not been with the intent of catching Wilhelm off guard, but rather, Wilhelm, are you unable to even show your face before me, Hankl? Hankl, HK. At Wilhelm's call, the other party recoiling could be felt through the atmosphere. Even if he lowered his head, stifled his voice, and endeavored to conceal his presence, Wilhelm had already been made aware that Hankl was among those complicit with Al, who had become a traitor opposing the kingdom. Al's actions were already more than enough of a threat to the survival of the kingdom. To not swing his sword amidst this critical situation was an impossibility for Wilhelm, former commander of the Royal Guard as he was. Even without such underlying circumstances, the reason as to why Wilhelm had resolved himself to take initiative and take up the sword was Hankl's presence. Wilhelm, in rough terms, you have been told that you will be lent dragon's blood if you cooperate, yes. Through those means, you intend to awaken your wife. Laoana, correct. In that case, your discretion has been far too lacking. Stored in the royal castle, dragon's blood certainly housed tremendous power. With that power of the kingdom's greatest treasure, even awakening Laoana Astria, slumbering for reasons unknown, was entirely possible. However, Wilhelm, you believe that Al Dono? No, that the turncoat known as Al will keep to his word? That individual betrayed those left behind by the master he served, Priscilla Bariel Summer, and is even attempting to cause a stir by deceiving those who had worried about him. Why in the world would he grant your desires alone? Volcanica, nah, well, I get that it might be dubious. But, that's way too one-sided. Wilhelm, exalted dragon of Lagunica, I am not speaking to you at the moment. As Wilhelm displayed an attitude and words that left it no place to interject, Volcanica fell silent with a MH. Towards the other side of the hushed dragon, to the person hiding on its back, he resumed, Wilhelm, what is the matter, unable to say a word? Perhaps I have hit the nail on the head, or perhaps you had not even considered it? I suppose that is right. For a long time already, you would do nothing but avert your face, plug your ears, run away from anything you found unpleasant. That is why even now, you do not even attempt to look at anything other than what is convenient for you. Hankl, HK, shut up, shut up, shut up. Wilhelm, Hankl, anything you please. HK, you just say anything you fucking please, don't you? No matter what I may do for Laoana, you've got no right to say anything about it. Father, with a blood-curdling bellow, a silhouette rose up from Volcanica's back, a face he knew, a voice he recognized. At the temper of the trembling finger thrust towards him, Wilhelm deeply sighed. It was a sigh consisting of exasperation and disappointment, as well as a faint relief. There were various reasons for that relief. One being whether he would still have any fighting spirit left to raise his face after being spoken to so insultingly, another being whether he would attempt to lay low as a coward whilst cooperating with a traitor. But, what could be said on the whole? Wilhelm, so, you have finally shown your face? Hankl, Wilhelm, well then? Have you no objections other than shouting noisily? Is your reason for supporting that man in accordance with my guesswork? If that is the case, can you think of why he would grant your desires alone? Have you worn yourself out by wishing, causing your eyes to cloud over? Hankl, I am. HK, as Wilhelm piled on the questions, the silhouette on the dragon's back Hankl hung his head. Wherever that explosive temper of his from a moment prior might have gone, it was easy to tell that he was dejected. And, The act of Hankl shrinking before Wilhelm was not something that had only begun now. Such had been the case for a long, long time already. Ever since he had taken his vows to become a knight, and had been granted Wilhelm's former beloved sword, Astria, felt, there's no doubt that Pops is aiming for the dragon's blood with the objective of waking up his sleeping wife. In place of Hankl, unable to form words with his eyes cast down, it was Felt who answered Wilhelm's question. Lowering her hand from rubbing her neck, Felt straightened her back. Despite being the most powerless person present, she wore an expression that gave no such impression whatsoever. Felt, I heard it straight from his mouth. Though I haven't heard all the details, Wilhelm. No, I thank you for your answer in my incompetent son's stead. Furthermore, I am sorry that you had to go along with such a dialogue. Felt, I don't need any backward apologies. I told this to Pops as well, but it's simply a matter of his methods being different to mine. It's got nothing to do with them being good or bad. Despite having been embroiled, and having suffered damages herself, there was no anger in Felt's response. From that dignified way of looking at things, Wilhelm certainly saw the capacity to be monarch within her. Unmistakably, Felt, like Crush, was one of the 5 individuals selected by the Dragon History Stone. And despite that, for that very divine dragon to be obstructing the way like this, Wilhelm, there would have already been many bearing witness to the sight of you having descended to the surface, mercilessly swinging your claws. The foundations of the Dragon Kingdom are shaking. Have you awareness of that, Volcanica? Yeah, I feel a bit bad. From the very bottom of my heart. But you see, even if the Dragon Kingdom reverts to being the Lion Kingdom, it'd still be way better than the complete destruction of the world, Wilhelm, although, I believe this rebellious spirit of yours is a matter of concern grave enough to be on par with the world's destruction. At the very least, there was no doubt that violent tremors would run through the kingdom of Volcanica in the near future. Those tremors would likely cause the jeopardous foundations of the kingdom to fissure, and those emergent cracks would likely swallow many. Even supposing the actions of Volcanica and the other traitors were for the purposes of opposing something that eclipsed even that, Wilhelm, even if an anomalous dragon is among them, that is not a situation for a mere few people to decide. Especially given that one of those few people is yet inexperienced, unable to see anything beyond their own feet, there is no salvation to be had for you lot. Volcanica, when including this exalted dragon, wouldn't it be a miraculous oracle from the heavens, Wilhelm? In that case, as you once did before, right now, at this moment, please save the many people who are struggling through the pain. And then, furthermore, given the greater amount of people it contains, you ought to save the entire world. If you are unable to do so, Volcanica, if I'm unable, Wilhelm, then I shall have no other choice but to consider you the same as my foolish son, puppeted by sweet words. Stating thus, Wilhelm held his twin swords at the ready, squaring off against the divine dragon Volcanica. The numbness that had arisen from repelling the first strike had faded from his hands. But, if that was an example of a volley, merely 3 more exchanges would suffice in wresting his sword away from him. Either evasion, or parrying to a much higher degree. Volcanica, don't move, Lil Miss Felt. I'm not confident in being able to have a soft touch on this, Felt, maybe I shouldn't listen to anything you say. Ever since Rom-G tried to pull the wool over my eyes, I've had plenty of resentment built up. Wilhelm, if that is the case, then I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause you for the time being. Felt, stop acting like you're on friendly terms with me. Shouting in anger, Felt scowled at Wilhelm and Volcanica in turn, sticking out her tongue. Sparing a minimal amount of his focus upon her, Wilhelm observed every single action of Volcanica's. Their position, likewise, was that of having rushed to the shinobi girl's rescue. With their figure having been sighted already, before long the commotion would magnify, and their freedom to fight would be limited. This, too, would be a short yet decisive bout. Volcanica, technically, even if decayed, I'm a dragon of legend, yeah? Shouldn't you be looking into options other than fighting? Wilhelm, unfortunately, I was just thinking that now is the time in which I must once more surpass a legend. My deepest apologies for making use of this convenience, but please endure my company. Hankl, HK, Volcanica's intimidation was met with Wilhelm's response. It was apparent to the latter that Hankl, having not spoken a word for a good while, had his breath hitch, had his cheeks stiffen, eyelids trembling unceasingly. Hankl's azure eyes regarded Wilhelm in bewilderment. Hankl, father, you don't mean. Wilhelm, with Hankl having seemingly realized something, Wilhelm shut both his eyes at once. Before Volcanica, that was far too recklessly defenseless an act. Yet, the trust that his opponent would not take advantage of that opportunity was a sense mutually shared through their fighting spirits. Surrendering his being to that sense, upon the back of his closed eyelids, Wilhelm's remorses were envisioned: an overcast sky, a headstone marking a vacant grave, bereft of any contents. A great multitude of attendees overcome with desolation, the words of His Majesty the King extolling that act of sacrifice for their duty, the son not present where he ought to have been, and his weak self devoid of the willpower to bring him there. And, at last, it's all right, honored grandfather. When she passed, honored grandmother wasn't the sword saint. That's why, the sword saint didn't lose, after all, the sword saint shouldn't ever lose. Father said so, so, don't be so sad, the Astria family is safe and sound, honored grandfather. Wilhelm, nothing, but the words of a child, words lacking any malice, from a child who had just inherited the qualifications to unsheathe the dragon's sword alongside the divine protection. Recollecting in great detail the remorses of that day, Wilhelm batted his eyelids open, and gazed at the dragon. At the divine dragon, its name writ in legend, once a savior of the kingdom, as it had attested itself, with the kingdom facing an existential threat, with the hearts of many in turmoil, the imprudence was well within his awareness. However, akin to the saving of the kingdom, of the world, Wilhelm possessed an important duty he needed to fulfill through his sword. An important duty, one impossible to fulfill with any means but the sword. Naught else did Wilhelm know. Naught but the way to return the sword saint to being human. Henceforth, for this blade of his, he sought swordsmanship akin to that which he held in the past, nay, swordsmanship greater than even that, and challenged the dragon. All for the sake of surpassing the legend that eclipsed legends, awaiting him beyond that point. Wilhelm, sword demon, Wilhelm Triers, Volcanica, divine dragon, Volcanica, simultaneous with their declarations, both sprung into action. By sword's shimmer and dragon's claws, all notions of sound were consigned to oblivion.